"Her name goes on that paper," Warren Norris said, his voice dropping to something quieter and far more dangerous than a shout. "Or no deal gets done. Not today. Not ever." The silence that followed those words inside the Redemption Creek Bank hung like smoke after a gunshot. Harlan Peck, the town's banker, sat behind his mahogany desk with his soft hands pressed flat against the loan documents, his face cycling through shades of red that had no business appearing on a living man's complexion. The brass clock on the wall ticked once, twice, 3 times. Nobody in that room moved. Warren stood at the desk with the kind of stillness that only men who have worked cattle through blizzards and droughts and bone-breaking silence ever truly master. His hat was in his hand, which was the only polite concession he had made to the indoors. His jaw was set like poured iron. His dark eyes did not waver from Harlan Peck's face, not for a single moment, because Warren Norris had come to this bank with one purpose, and he was not going to leave without it being accomplished. Behind him, Rose Rourke stood near the door with her hands clasped in front of her, and her chin lifted at an angle that cost her something, because she was a woman who had learned that dignity was not freely given in places like this. It had to be maintained by sheer, exhausting will. She was 26 years old, and she had been fighting for the right to simply exist on her own terms for most of those years, and she had never, not once in her life, had anyone stand in a banker's office and say the words Warren Norris had just said. Her name, on the paper. Harlan Peck cleared his throat. "Norris, I don't think you understand the legal nature of what you're asking. A woman cannot be a co-signatory on a commercial land loan in this territory. It simply is not done." "I didn't ask you what is done," Warren said. "I told you what I require." "You require," Peck repeated, as though tasting something sour. "You heard me correctly." Peck leaned back in his chair and laced his fingers over his stomach with the practiced ease of a man who believed his position conferred authority over all things. "The Norris Ranch account is one of this bank's oldest and most valued relationships," he said carefully. "I would hate to see that relationship strained over a matter that is frankly quite irregular." "Then put her name on the paper," Warren said, "and nothing gets strained." How they had arrived at this moment, this charged and impossible moment, in Harlan Peck's office on a Tuesday morning in October of 1884, was a story that neither of them had intended to be part of. Stories like this rarely begin with intention. They begin with necessity, and then they complicate themselves, and somewhere in the middle of the complication, two people look at each other and realize that the ground beneath their feet has shifted in a way that cannot be undone. The town of Redemption Creek, Texas, sat in a bend of the Colorado River where the land flattened out from the limestone hills, and the grass ran thick and golden in the fall. It was not a large town, but it was a persistent one. It had a general store, a blacksmith, a church, a schoolhouse, 2 saloons, a hotel, 3 competing dry goods merchants, and the first territorial bank of Redemption Creek, which Harlan Peck had managed with a tightly controlled iron fist since 1876. The town had grown up around the cattle trade, and the cattle trade had made certain men rich and certain men desperate, and the line between those two states of being shifted with the weather and the market, and the kind of luck that no man could predict or control. Warren Norris was 31 years old and had been running the Norris Ranch since he was 23, when his father died of a heart attack on horseback and left him the deed to 4,000 acres of river-bottom land, a herd of 1,200 cattle, 6 ranch hands, and a debt to the first territorial bank that had taken him 4 years to pay off. He had done it. He had worked himself down to sinew and silence doing it, and by 1882 he owned the ranch free and clear, which was more than most men in the county could say. He was not arrogant about this. Arrogance required a certain energy that Warren had never been able to spare. He was simply relentless in the way that the land itself was relentless, in the way that a river keeps cutting through stone, not because it is angry but because it has no other option. He was also, by most accounts in Redemption Creek, deeply, stubbornly alone. His ranch cook, an elderly Mexican woman named Senora Vasquez who had worked for his father and stayed on out of loyalty, and the conviction that Warren could not properly feed himself, had been telling him for 2 years that he needed a wife. His ranch foreman, a weathered man named Ike Calloway, who had ridden with Warren through every hard season the ranch had seen, said nothing on the subject, but communicated his concern through a series of meaningful looks that Warren had become skilled at ignoring. The town itself had opinions, as small towns always do, expressed in the form of well-meaning introductions at church socials and pointed mentions of so-and-so's daughter who had recently returned from the East with her schooling finished and her prospects wide open. Warren attended these events, ate the food people brought, spoke politely to the women he was introduced to, and then rode home and sat on his porch in the dark and felt nothing in particular. He told himself this was fine. He told himself that a ranch this size required full attention and did not leave room for the kind of vulnerability that love demanded. He told himself that he had learned early and painfully that caring too deeply for something you could not control was simply a different kind of ruin. He had never in his life told himself any of these things about Rose Rourke because he had not met her yet. Rose came to Redemption Creek in late August of 1884 on the San Antonio stage, carrying a trunk, a leather satchel, and a letter of introduction from a law office in Boston, Massachusetts. She had been born in Texas, in a small town near the Gulf Coast that no longer existed in any meaningful way, having been scattered by yellow fever and hard luck, and the particular cruelty of Reconstruction-era poverty before she was 10 years old. Her parents had died within 6 months of each other, her father from the fever and her mother from what people called a broken heart, though the more accurate diagnosis was exhaustion and grief, and a body that had simply run out of the will to continue. Rose had been sent to a maternal aunt in Boston, a childless schoolteacher named Margaret who had raised her with strict practicality and genuine affection, and a deep, unfashionable conviction that women ought to be educated. Margaret had died in the spring of 1884, leaving Rose a modest inheritance, a library of several hundred books, and the acute awareness that she was 26 years old, alone in a city where she had never fully belonged, and possessed of skills that had no obvious market in the drawing rooms and millinery shops of Boston society. She could ride a horse. She could read a land survey. She understood cattle grazing practices and crop rotation from the agricultural journals Margaret had inexplicably subscribed to. She could maintain a household ledger with perfect accuracy. She spoke plainly and directly, and had no patience for the particular performance that Eastern social convention required of women her age. She had decided, with the pragmatic clarity that had always been her most reliable tool, to go back to Texas. The letter she carried was addressed to a rancher named Clarence Webb, who had placed a somewhat unusual advertisement in an agricultural newsletter seeking a ranch bookkeeper and household manager, someone who understood the business of cattle ranching and could keep the accounts in order. It was not a matrimonial advertisement, which Rose had noted with relief. She was not opposed to marriage precisely, but she had seen enough of the transactions that passed for romance in both Boston drawing rooms and Western settlements to approach the subject with considerable caution. She wanted work. She wanted to be useful in a way that made sense to her. She wanted land under her feet and clean air, and the particular satisfaction of accounts that balanced. What she did not want, and what she could not have anticipated, was that Clarence Webb would drop dead of apoplexy the week before she arrived, leaving his entire estate in legal chaos, his ranch in the hands of a distant nephew who had ridden out from Dallas and immediately demonstrated that he understood nothing about cattle, and Rose standing in the stage depot in Redemption Creek with a letter addressed to a dead man and no plan. It was Senora Vasquez's cousin, a woman named Dolores who ran the town's only laundry, who told Rose about the situation at the Norris ranch. "He needs someone who can keep books," Dolores said, folding a shirt with practiced efficiency while Rose sat at the laundry counter trying to reorganize her understanding of the immediate future. His last bookkeeper left in June, went to Amarillo with a cattle buyer who had more money than sense. Warren Norris is good with cattle and terrible with paperwork, and everyone in town knows it. Does he pay fairly? Rose asked, because this was the relevant question. He pays what he agrees to pay, Dollar said. He is not a man who cheats. Rose had arrived at the Norris ranch the following morning on a borrowed horse with her leather satchel over her shoulder. Warren had been in the barn when she rode up, and he had come out into the September sunshine with straw in his dark hair and grease on his hands from some piece of machinery he had been attempting to repair, and he had looked at her the way a person looks at something unexpected that has appeared in a context where unexpected things are not usually welcome. "You're not from the agency," he said. It was not a question. He had written to a bookkeeping agency in San Antonio 3 weeks earlier, but the agency had sent nothing yet. "No," Rose said. "I'm from Boston by way of Corpus Christi, by way of circumstances that have recently become complicated. I understand you need a bookkeeper." "I keep books. I'd like the job." Warren had stared at her for a moment with an expression she could not quite read. It was not hostile exactly. It was more like the expression of a man performing a rapid series of internal calculations about a situation that had not appeared in any of his preparations. "Do you know cattle?" he said. "I know the business of cattle," Rose said. "I know grazing rotation and market pricing and the cost structure of a working ranch. I read every agricultural journal my aunt subscribed to for 15 years. Another pause. The wind moved through the cottonwoods along the creek, and somewhere out in the pasture, a cow made a long, low sound. "The position is for a bookkeeper," Warren said. "Not a partner." "I'm aware," Rose said. "I'm applying to be a bookkeeper." He had hired her. She had taken the spare room in the ranch house, which was more a small, clean addition off the kitchen than a proper guest room, and within 2 days she had organized his account books, which were a genuine catastrophe of inconsistent notation and missing entries, into something that could be read and understood by a human being. Within a week, she had found 3 separate billing errors from suppliers that had been costing the ranch money for months. Warren had looked at the corrections she showed him with an expression that she was beginning to learn meant that he was surprised but not willing to admit it. "You're good at this," he said on the Friday of her first week, looking at the neatly ordered ledger she placed in front of him. "I know," Rose said. He had almost smiled. She had noticed this, catalogued it, and told herself it was not significant. The weeks that followed had a rhythm to them that Rose found unexpectedly satisfying. She worked the accounts in the mornings and spent the afternoons learning the ranch's operational patterns, because good bookkeeping required understanding what you were accounting for. She rode out with Ike Calloway to count cattle and assess pasture conditions. She talked with Senora Vasquez about supply costs and seasonal purchasing. She sat in on the weekly meetings Warren held with his foreman to plan the week's work, saying nothing the first 2 weeks, taking notes, and then in the 3rd week pointing out quietly that the southern fence repair and the cattle rotation schedule were in direct conflict with each other and would create a problem on Thursday. Warren had looked at her across the table. She had looked back. "She's right," Ike Calloway said. They had rearranged the schedule. What Rose had not planned for, and what she found herself quietly cataloging in the private hours of the evening when she sat with a book and the lamp burning low, was the man himself. Warren Norris was not what the town had led her to expect. The town tended to describe him in terms of his stubbornness, his silence, his relentless solitary competence. What they did not mention, perhaps because they had not noticed or perhaps because it was not the kind of thing that made for good saloon talk, was that he was profoundly fair. He was fair with his ranch hands in a territory where that was not universal. He was fair with the Mexican families who worked the eastern pastures, including them in the ranch's decisions in ways that most Anglo ranchers in 1884 Texas would not have considered. He paid wages that matched the work and did not adjust them based on what a man looked like or where he had come from. Rose had seen the payroll records. The fairness was documented in ink. He was also, she discovered, quietly funny. Not in the way of a man who told jokes or performed for an audience, but in the way of a man who saw the absurdity in things, and occasionally noted it with such precise economy of language that it took a moment to register. There was the afternoon in early October when the new bull they had purchased from a ranch in Uvalde County got loose in the kitchen garden Senora Vasquez kept behind the house and destroyed 3 weeks of careful cultivation. "I'll pay for the damage," Warren told Senora Vasquez, surveying the wreckage of the garden with the expressionless gravity he brought to most catastrophes. "You will also replant it," Senora Vasquez said. "I will hire someone to replant it. You will replant it with your own hands. It will be good for you." Warren had turned then and looked at Rose, who was standing in the garden doorway watching this exchange, and said, with perfect neutrality, "I went a considerable effort to purchase the most expensive and difficult animal in 4 counties. Rose had laughed. It surprised her, the way it came out full and genuine rather than the careful social laugh she had spent years deploying. Warren had looked at her when she laughed with something in his expression that she did not examine too closely, because examining it would require her to confront what she already suspected she felt, and that was a complication she was not ready for. She had been hired as his bookkeeper. She lived on his property. The power arrangement between them was not simple, and she was not a woman who made decisions about her own heart without accounting for the full ledger of a situation. She told herself to be careful. She told herself that the warmth she felt when he walked into the room where she was working was simply the comfort of a stable situation after a year of uncertainty. She told herself many things with diminishing success. The crisis arrived, as most crises in cattle country do, in the form of a drought in a bank. The summer of 1884 had been dry. Not catastrophically dry, not the kind of biblical drought that stripped the land down to cracked clay and despair, but dry enough that the southern pastures had not recovered the way Warren had planned, and dry enough that the hay supply going into winter was going to be significantly short of what the herd required. There were options, but all of them required capital. He could buy hay at ruinous fall prices from suppliers in hill country who had had a better season. He could reduce the herd, selling cattle at a moment when beef prices were depressed, because half the ranchers in Texas were doing the same thing for the same reasons. Or he could purchase the additional 800 acres adjacent to the ranch's eastern border that had just come available when the Marsh family, broken by 5 years of bad luck, finally gave up and sold out. The eastern land had 3 functioning water sources and grass that was in considerably better condition than Warren's southern pastures. With that land added to the ranch's holdings, the grazing rotation could be restructured to give the southern pastures a full year of recovery. It was the obvious long-term solution. The problem was that buying the Marsh land required a loan, and getting a loan meant going to Harlan Peck. Warren had explained this situation to Rose one evening in early October, sitting at the kitchen table with the accounts spread between them and the lamp burning. He had spread out the numbers methodically, the purchase price, the projected loan terms, the expected return once the herd recovered and market prices improved. He presented it like a man making a case, which was what he was doing. Rose had listened, and then she had looked at the numbers, and then she had said, "Your current debt-to-asset ratio makes you a good credit risk. The loan should be straightforward." "In theory," Warren said. There was something in the way he said those 2 words that made Rose look up from the papers. "What aren't you saying?" she asked. He was quiet for a moment. Warren's silences were not evasions, she had learned. They were the space in which he assembled words that meant exactly what he intended them to mean. "The Marsh land," he said finally, "is the same land that my father tried to buy in 1872. Peck's father, who ran the bank before Harlan, refused to finance it on terms that made any sense. My father always believed it was because old Peck had a private arrangement with the land company that eventually bought that section. I can't prove it, but Harlan Peck knows our history, and our history with this bank is not entirely smooth. You said you paid off the debt. I did. But paying off a debt doesn't erase the fact that someone wanted to keep you in it. Rose looked at him across the table. The lamplight caught the lines of his face, the weathering of years of outdoor work, the set of his jaw that she had come to read as thoughtfulness rather than stubbornness, though it was sometimes both. Then we make the application as strong as possible, she said. The accounts are in good order. I can put together a full financial statement and a 5-year projection that will leave Peck no reasonable grounds for refusal. She had spent 3 days on those documents. She had cross-checked every number, documented every asset, constructed the 5-year projection with conservative estimates and multiple scenarios. It was the best loan application Harlan Peck had likely ever received, and she told Warren this with calm confidence when she handed it to him. He had looked through it carefully, turning pages with the focused attention he brought to everything that mattered. "This is thorough," he said. "It's complete," Rose said. "There is no number in those documents he can question." What she had not included, and what she had not told Warren, was that she had written herself into the operational structure of the ranch more thoroughly than either of them had formally acknowledged. She had been running the financial management of the Norris Ranch for 6 weeks. She had restructured the accounts payable system, negotiated improved terms with 2 suppliers, and identified cost savings that had already improved the ranch's quarterly balance. She was, by any functional definition, not merely a bookkeeper but a financial manager, and the ranch's improved financial position going into this loan application was in no small part a result of her work. She had not said this. She had prepared the documents in Warren's name, as was proper and expected, because Rose Rourke was a woman in Texas in 1884, and she understood with clear-eyed realism that the world she lived in did not typically extend formal recognition to the contributions of women in business contexts. She had prepared the documents and handed them to Warren and sent him to the bank and told herself this was fine. She went with him to the bank because he asked her to. He said he wanted her there to answer any technical questions about the financial projections because she had built them and knew every number. She agreed because it was reasonable. She had not expected what happened. Harlan Peck had received them with the particular brand of courteous condescension that men of his type deploy to maintain the fiction that they are being gracious, while simultaneously making clear that their hospitality is contingent on your compliance. He had shaken Warren's hand. He had nodded at Rose with the expression of a man, acknowledging the presence of a piece of furniture that has been placed in an unusual location. He had looked through the loan documents with the slow, deliberate pace of a man who wants you to understand that your time is worth less than his. He had asked several questions that Rose answered crisply and accurately, while Peck continued to direct his attention to Warren as though the answers were coming from a different source. And then Harlan Peck had placed the actual loan contract in front of Warren and said, "If you'll just sign here, Norris, we can get this moving today." Rose had looked at the contract. She had looked at it carefully because she had a habit of reading everything carefully, which was both a professional skill and a personal survival mechanism. She had read the terms, and the terms were not what had been discussed. The interest rate was slightly higher. The repayment schedule was slightly shorter. Neither change was enormous in isolation, but together they added a pressure to the loan that the original terms would not have included, and the adjustment to the repayment schedule in particular created a vulnerability in the 3rd year that could, in a bad cattle year, become genuinely dangerous. But there was something else she saw, something that made her go still in her chair. The documents included a security clause, standard enough on a land loan. But the way it was written, the collateral was structured not just against the new land being purchased, but against existing Norris Ranch holdings, and the triggering conditions for that collateral clause were written broadly enough that a creative banker could invoke them under circumstances that were not limited to actual default. It was not illegal, precisely. It was the kind of language that looked like standard boilerplate to someone not accustomed to reading financial contracts carefully, but which was in fact a mechanism, a trap. Rose had been sitting in Harlan Peck's office reading this clause and understanding what it was, and something cold and bright had moved through her, because she recognized this kind of contract. Margaret's law office friends in Boston had talked about this kind of instrument. It was the sort of thing that let a bank call a loan not because the borrower had failed to pay, but because the bank wanted to. It was the mechanism by which the elder Peck had likely operated in 1872, and the son was apparently continuing the tradition. She had opened her mouth to speak, and Warren had looked at her, because he had been watching her read with the attention of a man who trusts someone else's expertise in a domain he knows is not his own, and he had seen something in her expression, and before she could find the words to explain what she had found, he had looked back at Peck and said, "This isn't what we discussed." "The terms are quite standard," Peck said. "Miss Rourke," Warren said, not taking his eyes off Peck, "would you explain to Mr. Peck what you found?" Rose had explained. She had done it in the clear, direct language she used when numbers needed to speak plainly, walking through the collateral clause and its triggering conditions, and the difference between these terms and the terms Peck had outlined in his preliminary conversation. Peck had listened with the expression of a man watching a performance he considers technically impressive but fundamentally offensive. "You understand financial documents well for a bookkeeper," Peck said when she finished. The word "for" was doing a great deal of work in that sentence, and all of it was designed to remind her of her place. Rose had said nothing. She was very good at strategic silence when the moment required it. Warren had leaned forward. He had said with the perfect, controlled calm that Rose had come to understand was his most dangerous register, "Revise the contract, the terms we discussed, and I want the collateral clause rewritten." Peck had made the revision slowly, with the reluctance of a man being made to undo something he was proud of. He had produced a new contract with the corrected terms, and it sat there on the desk, and everything should have proceeded from that point. Except that when Rose looked at the new contract, the signatory line had only one name on it: Warren Norris, single party to the loan. And something in her had shifted, quietly and completely, as she looked at that single line, because she understood what it meant. She had done the work. She had found the trap. She had built the documents that made this loan possible. And the paper said one name, and it was not hers, and it was not supposed to be, because that was simply how things worked, and she had known that. She had always known that, and still something in her chest ached with the particular quiet grief of being invisible in a room where your work was on every page. She had not said anything. She was going to say nothing. She was going to sit here and be professional and composed and tell herself this was fine. And Warren had picked up the pen, and then he had set the pen back down, and he had looked at the signatory line for a moment with the focused, internal calculation expression that Rose had spent 2 months learning to read. And he had looked at Rose, and something had passed between them in that look that was not nothing. It was the accumulated weight of 2 months of mornings, at the kitchen table and evenings, going over accounts and afternoons writing fence lines, and every conversation that had mattered, and every silence that had said more than conversation. It was the weight of a man who had been watching a woman work and had understood, really understood, what that work was worth, and who had arrived at a decision that was going to complicate every convenient arrangement of his life, but which he found, arriving at it, was not actually a choice at all. He had turned to Harlan Peck. He had said, in a voice that would carry the story through Redemption Creek for the next 20 years, "Her name goes on that paper or no deal gets done. Not today. Not ever." Harlan Peck's face had gone through its array of colors. He had argued. He had cited legal convention and banking practice and the simple impossibility of the thing. Warren had sat in his chair with the stillness of a man who has made a decision and is waiting for the world to catch up to it. It was Rose who finally spoke. "I'm employed as the financial manager of the Norris Ranch," she said, in the cool, precise voice that she used when she wanted people to understand that the discussion was settled. "I have been responsible for the financial management of the property for the past 6 weeks. The documents supporting this loan application were prepared by me. The improvements in the ranch's financial position that make this loan viable are the result of my work. If the ranch is taking on this financial obligation, then the financial manager of the ranch should be a party to the instrument." Peck stared at her. "I'm not asking for a favor," Rose said. "I am asking for accurate documentation." The silence stretched. Warren said nothing. He had said what he needed to say. He was letting Rose speak now, which she understood was itself a statement, and one that meant something more to her than she could immediately process. Harlan Peck, who was at the end of the day a businessman and who understood that the Norris Ranch was a valuable account that he did not actually want to lose, made the calculation that all businessmen ultimately make when principle and profit come into conflict. He pulled out a fresh contract form. He wrote in the terms. He wrote in the signatory lines, "Warren Norris, Rose Rourke." Rose signed her name with the pen Peck handed her, and her hand was steady, and her signature was clear and legible, and it sat there on the paper next to Warren's name like it had always been meant to be there. They did not speak until they were outside the bank, standing in the October sunlight with the Colorado River glittering at the end of the main street, and the town going about its ordinary business around them. Rose was looking at the copy of the contract she held in her hands, at her own name on it, and she was working to compose herself, because she felt something rising in her that was not appropriate to display on a public street. "Thank you," she said finally, and her voice was not quite as controlled as she intended it to be. Warren was standing beside her with his hat back on, looking not at the contract but at her. There was an expression on his face that she had not seen before, or perhaps she had seen it and not allowed herself to fully register what it was. "You found the trap in his original contract," he said. "Yes. That would have cost me the ranch eventually. Yes. It was written to allow him to call the loan under conditions he could manufacture." "Then putting your name on the paper is the least you're owed," Warren said, and his voice was quiet and direct in the way that his most important statements always were. "You work for the Norris Ranch. You should be on the documents of the Norris Ranch. That's just accurate." Rose looked at him. "It is not how things are generally done." "I don't run my ranch by how things are generally done," Warren said. "I run it by what makes sense." They stood there in the sunlight, and something shifted between them that had been shifting for weeks, was shifting even now, and Rose thought that she had spent 2 months being very careful not to feel what she was currently feeling, and that the effort had been, on reflection, entirely wasted. "We should get back to the ranch," she said. "Yes," Warren said. They rode back together, which was how they had come, with an hour of open country between the town and the ranch, and the sky very large and very blue above them, and the grass moving in long golden waves in the October wind. "About halfway home," Warren said without looking at her, "I've been meaning to say something to you." Rose kept her eyes forward. "Go ahead." "You should have a formal contract of employment," he said, "not just the arrangement we started with, a proper document that says what your position is and what your responsibilities are and what you're paid, so there's no ambiguity." Rose was quiet for a moment. This was not what she had expected him to say, and she was recalibrating. "That's reasonable," she said. "I'll draw it up this week." "I can draw it up," Rose said. "I'm better at documents than you are." There was a pause, and then Warren said, "That's true." And there was something in the 2 words that was warm and dry and alive, and Rose looked at him then and found him already looking at her, and neither of them looked away for a moment too long to be entirely professional. The formal employment contract was completed and signed that Thursday. The position was listed as Ranch Financial Manager and Administrator. The salary was generous to the point that Rose looked up from reading it and said, "This is more than I asked for." It's what the position is worth, Warren said. She had signed it and he had signed it, and it had gone into the ranch's files, and things between them had not returned to the careful professional distance she had been maintaining before the bank, because that distance had been fictional even before the bank, and they both knew it now. October deepened. The nights turned cold and the stars came out very sharp and clear over the ranch. They worked in the evenings at the kitchen table as they always had, but the silence between them was different now. It had a quality of waiting to it, like the air before rain. One evening Warren came in from the barn later than usual, his coat still on, and found Rose at the table with the lamp burning and a letter open beside the ledger she was working in. He read enough of her face to know the letter was not good news. "What is it?" he asked. "It's from a law firm in Boston," she said. "There's a dispute over my aunt's estate. Someone is challenging the will. A distant cousin who didn't know Margaret existed until there was money to argue about." She said this with the flat, controlled calm that she used when she was containing something larger underneath. "They want me to come back to Boston to address it in person." Warren sat down across from her. "Do you have to go? The lawyer says it would help my case considerably." She looked at the letter for a moment. "I don't have the money for the train fare to Boston and back, not right now, not until the first of the year accounts are settled." "I can advance you the money," Warren said immediately. Rose looked up. "I'm not borrowing money from my employer. Consider it part of your compensation, an advance against the December settlement." Warren, Rose, they looked at each other. Her name in his mouth had a weight it hadn't had 6 weeks ago, and they both felt it. "I don't want to go back to Boston," she said, and the honesty of this surprised her as she said it, the degree to which it was true. "I have never belonged in Boston. I came back to Texas because this is where I belong, and I have found a place here that feels like something I have been looking for without knowing I was looking." There was a silence. "Then don't go," Warren said. "Write to the lawyer and explain the circumstances and let them handle it by correspondence. If the case goes against you, you lose whatever remains of the estate. If Margaret left you the money and the cousin is disputing it on thin grounds, the lawyer should be able to manage it. I might lose the inheritance." "Is the inheritance why you came back to Texas?" "No," she said. "Then what do you stand to lose?" he asked. She looked at him. In the lamplight his face was very clear, the strong lines of it, the eyes that were always paying attention, always present, never sliding away from the thing in front of them. "Nothing that matters more than what I've found here," she said, and this was the most honest thing she had said to anyone in years. Warren was quiet for a long moment. The clock on the kitchen shelf ticked. Outside, the wind moved through the cottonwoods. "I need to tell you something," he said. "All right. I have been spending the past 2 months attempting to maintain an appropriate professional arrangement," he said, with the careful precision of a man choosing every word from a very small and very valuable supply. "And I have found that effort increasingly incompatible with the fact that you are the most important person on this ranch, and possibly the most important person I've encountered in my life. And I don't have a straightforward way to say that without it changing the terms of your employment in a way that I want to be careful about, because you came here for work and not for this, and I don't want you to feel that anything I'm saying constitutes pressure." Rose stared at him. He continued, still carefully. "So I am saying it plainly so that it is documented, as it were. I am telling you that I have feelings for you that are well beyond professional. And I am telling you that whatever you do with that information is entirely your decision, and I will not allow it to affect your position here regardless of your answer. Your contract is your contract." The silence that followed this declaration was the loudest thing Rose had heard in some time. "That," she said finally, "is quite possibly the most unusual declaration of affection I have ever received." "I'm not an unusual man," Warren said, "but I try to be a clear one. You are, in fact, both." He looked at her. She looked at him. And the lamplight was warm and the kitchen was quiet and the distance across the table between them was not very great at all. "I have also been maintaining a professional arrangement that I have found increasingly difficult to maintain," Rose said, "for what I believe are the same reasons you've described. And I want you to know that I came back to Texas looking for a place that felt like mine. And when I am in this kitchen with you, working on these accounts, or riding out to the east pasture, or listening to you argue with Senora Vasquez about the garden, I feel more like myself than I have felt since I was a child in a place I belonged. Warren stood up slowly from his chair. He came around the table. He stood before her, close but not quite touching, and looked at her with the full, complete attention that he gave to everything that mattered to him. "May I?" he said. She stood. She was nearly his height, and they were very close together in the lamplight, and she said, "Yes." And he took her face in his calloused hands with extraordinary care, and kissed her in a way that managed to be both tentative and entirely certain, which was exactly how Warren Norris did everything. When they stepped back from each other, there was a quality in the kitchen air that felt permanently altered, the way a room feels after lightning has struck close by. "I should probably not kiss the ranch financial manager," Warren said. "You should probably marry her instead," Rose said, and then looked briefly surprised at herself, because she had not planned to say that, but it was so clearly true that it had simply arrived. Warren went very still. "Is that a proposal?" "It is an observation," Rose said, recovering. "You're the man, you do the proposing." "I'm not a man who kneels," Warren said. "I do everything standing up." "I know," she said. "Rose Rourke," he said, looking at her directly in the way that cut through every layer of careful distance she had ever constructed, "I want you to stay on this ranch. Not as the bookkeeper and not as the financial manager, though I do need you to do both of those things because I am genuinely helpless at accounts. I want you to stay because you belong here and because I love you, which I have known for some time but have been managing poorly. Will you marry me?" "Yes," she said, and she said it the same way she signed documents, cleanly and without hesitation, because she had read all the numbers and the case was clear. He kissed her again, less tentatively this time. Senora Vasquez appeared in the kitchen doorway with the uncanny timing of a woman who had been hoping for exactly this development for approximately 6 weeks, took one look at the situation, said "Finalmente," and went back to wherever she had come from. Warren and Rose were both laughing when they separated, and it was the good kind of laughter, the kind that comes from joy rather than performance, and the kitchen felt very warm and very full. The wedding was planned for December, which gave Rose 2 months to write to the Boston lawyer, resolve the estate dispute by correspondence. The lawyer managed it. The distant cousin's case was indeed thin, and organized the practical matters of her life. It gave Warren 2 months to do what Ike Calloway described as visibly being in a better mood for the first time in recorded history, which manifested primarily as Warren walking around the ranch with a quality of presence that was more settled and less braced than it had been, as though he had put down something heavy he had been carrying for a long time. The town of Redemption Creek had opinions about the engagement, as it had opinions about everything. Most of them were good. Dolers, who had initially sent Rose to the Norris Ranch, took personal credit for the entire situation and accepted congratulations with dignified pleasure. The minister of the Redemption Creek Baptist Church, a man named Reverend Hollies, who had been gently attempting to arrange Warren's eventual marriage for 3 years, expressed genuine and uncomplicated delight. Harlan Peck, when the news reached him, said nothing publicly. He had, however, apparently spent some time reviewing his loan files with increased attention, because 2 weeks after the bank visit, he had sent a brief written communication to the Norris Ranch indicating that he had reviewed the collateral clause in question and found it to be an administrative error that had been corrected in their account. Rose had read this communication at the kitchen table and said to Warren, "He's covering himself." "Yes," Warren said. "Does it bother you?" Warren thought about this with his characteristic honest consideration. "Less than it would have," he said. "You caught it, that's what matters." There was one other matter that required addressing before the wedding, which was the matter of the eastern land and the loan they had secured to purchase it. The marsh land acquisition was completed in November. which was a significant and complicated process involving surveyors and deed transfers and negotiations with the family's San Antonio attorneys that consumed considerable energy. Rose managed the paperwork with the efficiency she brought to all paperwork, and when the deed was finally transferred and recorded in the county records, it listed both Warren Norris and Rose Rourke as parties to the transaction, because their names were both on the loan document and the loan document was accurate. "We own land together," Rose said, looking at the deed. "We're not even married yet." "We will be in 3 weeks," Warren said. "I'm pointing it out because it is unusual." "I thought you were the one who described banking accuracy as the relevant standard," he said. She looked at him. He was almost smiling. He had been almost smiling a great deal in the past weeks, which Ike Calloway had noted was somewhat unnerving but ultimately acceptable. "You're very irritating when you use my own arguments," Rose said. "I pay attention to good arguments," he said. "I've learned from the best." She kissed him, which was a thing she had found she could do now, whenever she wanted to, which remained a pleasure that had not diminished at all from novelty. The wedding was on a Saturday in mid-December, and the weather cooperated with the suspicious generosity that Texas sometimes displays in winter, producing a clear, cold, brilliantly sunny day with no wind and blue sky all the way to the horizon. Reverend Hollis performed the ceremony in the Redemption Creek Baptist Church, which was filled to capacity because most of the town had decided to attend on the grounds that Warren Norris finally getting married was a community event worth witnessing. Rose wore her best dress, which was a deep blue wool that she had bought in San Antonio specifically for this occasion, because she was a woman who believed in appropriate clothing for significant events. She carried a small bunch of late-season wildflowers that Señora Vasquez had produced through methods that remained unclear, since there were very few wildflowers in December. But Señora Vasquez had a way with plants that defied ordinary explanation. Warren wore his best suit, which Ike Calloway had apparently spent 3 days ensuring was properly pressed, and he stood at the front of the church with a quality of calm certainty that looked, to anyone watching, less like a man enduring a formal occasion and more like a man arriving at a place he had been traveling toward for some time. When Rose walked down the aisle of that small church on a borrowed arm, Dolar's husband, a kind man named Eduardo, had offered, she saw Warren's face when he looked at her, and the expression on it was so open and so entirely undefended that she had to stop for a moment and collect herself before she continued walking. She was not a woman who cried easily. She had spent years learning not to cry easily. But Warren Norris looking at her like that, in front of the whole gathered town, without any of the careful management she was accustomed to seeing in men's faces, was something that bypassed all of her careful defenses. She reached him. He took her hand. "Hello," he said quietly just for her. "Hello," she said. Reverend Hollis, who had been watching this exchange with an expression of profound personal satisfaction, began the ceremony. They said their vows in the clear, direct manner of two people who meant exactly what they were saying. When Warren said, "I will," it had the quality of a contract, which Rose recognized and loved completely, because she was a woman for whom contracts were the highest form of commitment. When Rose said, "I will," she said it with the same steady certainty she brought to every document she had ever signed, which Warren recognized, and which did something to the carefully maintained equilibrium of his composure that he managed, narrowly, to keep from being visible. Reverend Hollis pronounced them married, and Warren kissed his wife with considerably more public warmth than most people in Redemption Creek had expected from him, and the church responded with the kind of applause that small towns only generate when something has been a long time coming and has finally arrived. The wedding supper was at the ranch, because the ranch house was the largest available venue, and because Señora Vasquez had been planning the menu for 3 weeks with the focused intensity she brought to all important projects. There was food enough for twice the number of people present, which was exactly as intended. There was music from a fiddle player named Tom Reyes, who was Senora Vasquez's nephew, and who played with a sweetness that made the cottonwood trees along the creek seem to lean in and listen. Rose danced. She had not expected to dance, because she was not certain Warren danced, but Warren, it turned out, danced with the same focused competence he brought to everything physical, and they moved together in the lamplight of the ranch yard while the fiddle played and the stars came out overhead, very large and very close, the way stars are in Texas in December. "I have a confession," Rose said, while they were dancing. "All right," Warren said. "When I arrived here in August on that borrowed horse, I was not nearly as composed as I appeared." "I know," he said. She looked at him. "You knew. You were very controlled about it. But you gripped that satchel like it was the only stable thing in your world." He paused. "I recognized it. I've held on to things like that." Rose thought about this. About a young man of 23 who had inherited a ranch and a debt and the entire weight of his father's life, and had held on to it all with both hands and gotten through it by pure determined will. "What did you hold on to?" she asked. "The land," he said simply. "And the idea that if I just kept working, things would eventually become what they were supposed to be. Did they?" He looked at her, this woman who had arrived on his property with a leather satchel and competence, and a way of reading numbers that had saved his ranch, and a way of laughing that had undone his very careful solitude. And he said, "Yes, they did." They danced until the stars had moved a considerable distance across the sky, and then the guests went home, and the fiddle player packed his instrument, and the ranch settled into the particular quiet of a winter night after celebration. They stood together on the porch in the cold, Rose's shoulder against Warren's arm, looking out at the dark land that was theirs, both of them, and equally. "I've been thinking," Rose said. "I know," Warren said. "You're always thinking. The southern pastures will need a full season to recover, even with the eastern land providing relief. That means the grazing rotation schedule needs to be restructured starting in February." "Rose, what? It's our wedding night." She turned to look at him. His face in the cold moonlight was entirely warm. "I'm aware," she said. "I was getting to that." "Were you?" "The grazing rotation can wait until morning," she said. "I was simply noting it." "I'm relieved to hear it," he said. And he took her hand and led her inside, and the porch light went out, and the ranch was quiet and dark and complete. The winter of 1884 into 1885 was a good one, by Texas standards. The Colorado River ran clear under its skin of ice, and the cattle on the eastern pastures did well on the preserved grass and the supplemental hay that Warren had been able to purchase, at better prices than feared, in November. Rose spent the winter working on the restructured financial systems for the combined ranch holdings, updating the accounts to reflect the new land and revised operational costs, and the improved grazing strategy. She was thorough and methodical, and she wrote everything down twice, because that was how she worked, and the result was a set of ranch records that were the most accurate and useful in the county. She was also, as she had settled into the life she had chosen, visibly happy, not in a showy or performative way, because Rose was not a showy person, but in the deep, quiet way of someone who has found the thing they were made for and is doing it. She rode out with Warren in the mornings when the weather permitted. She talked cattle with Ike Calloway, who had initially received her appointment as ranch manager with careful neutrality, and had over the fall been converted by the sheer quality of her work into a genuine admirer. She read to Senora Vasquez in the evenings when the older woman's eyes were tired, alternating between the agricultural journals that arrived by mail and the novels that Rose had brought in her trunk from Boston. Senora Vasquez, whose given name was Carmen, had lived on the Norris Ranch for 23 years. She was 60 years old and had been born in Coahuila, Mexico, and had crossed the Rio Grande with her late husband during the chaos of the Texas Revolution's aftermath, when the border between nationalities was less a legal fact and more a state of ongoing negotiation. She was a woman of formidable practical intelligence and fierce loyalty, and she had been, for the past several years, the closest thing Warren had to family. She had adopted Rose into this arrangement with an ease that suggested she had been expecting someone like Rose to appear and had simply been waiting for the timing to be correct. In February of 1885, Rose told Warren she was pregnant. She told him at the kitchen table, which was where all significant information was exchanged in their household, with the lamp burning and the account books in front of them, because the account books were always in front of them in the evenings. She had not planned this particular moment, but she had been sitting with the knowledge for a week, and it had been becoming increasingly difficult to concentrate on quarterly projections. Warren looked up from the page she had put in front of him. She said, "In August, I think. I haven't been to the doctor yet." He was quiet. She watched his face, which was going through something she hadn't seen before, a series of expressions that were less controlled than his usual register, layered and fast-moving and culminating in something that was very clearly joy, the kind that arrives too large to manage. "August," he said. "Give or take." He stood up. He came around the table, which he had done before in important moments, and he stood in front of her, and she stood to meet him, and he put his arms around her and held her with a care that communicated, without any words at all, everything he was feeling. "Are you all right?" he said into her hair. "I'm perfectly well," she said. "I'm not fragile, Warren." "I know you're not fragile," he said. "I'm asking if you're all right." She understood the difference. She leaned into him a little more. "I'm all right," she said. "I'm more than all right." Senora Vasquez, when told, wept briefly and then immediately began planning dietary adjustments that she felt were essential and non-negotiable. Ike Calloway said nothing, but went out to the barn, and when he came back his eyes were suspiciously bright, and he spent the rest of the afternoon doing fence work that did not strictly need doing, but which apparently needed doing right then. Dr. Ambrose Finley in Redemption Creek confirmed the pregnancy in March and told Rose she was healthy and everything was progressing normally, and that he expected no complications, which was accurate. Rose continued to work throughout the spring, adjusting her schedule as her body required it but refusing to treat pregnancy as a condition that precluded competence. Warren had, early on, made a quiet attempt to suggest she might want to reduce her workload. She had looked at him with such precise and calibrated patience that he had recognized the expression as one he had seen on his own face in mirrors, and understood that the conversation was concluded. He did, however, take over the longer horseback rides by April, which Rose accepted as a reasonable accommodation, and he had the kitchen chair she preferred replaced with one that had better support, which she pretended not to notice while clearly appreciating it. The spring brought its own complications, as springs on cattle ranches always do. There was a problem with a portion of the fencing on the eastern land that had not been properly maintained by the Marsh family in their final years, and repairing it took 2 weeks and significant expense. There was a difficult season of calving in March that required everyone on the ranch to work extended hours for 3 weeks straight. There was a dispute with a neighboring rancher, a man named Callum Bright, who claimed that one of his cattle drives had damaged water access on Norris land and refused to acknowledge responsibility. Warren handled this dispute with the same controlled directness he brought to the bank, which resulted in a series of increasingly tense conversations with Callum Bright that eventually arrived at a settlement that was not entirely satisfactory to either party but which was legally documented, which Rose had insisted upon. "Get it in writing," she had said, which had become, in the 8 months since she had arrived in Redemption Creek, something of a philosophy on the Norris ranch. In late April, Rose received a letter from the Boston law firm. The estate matter had been settled in her favor. Margaret's will had stood. The inheritance, minus the lawyer's fees, which were not inconsiderable, was hers. It was not a large sum, but it was real money, and Rose sat with the letter and thought about what to do with it for several days. She brought it to the kitchen table one evening as she brought all significant decisions. "I want to put it into the ranch," she said. Warren looked at her. "It's your inheritance, and this is my ranch," Rose said. gesturing in a way that encompassed the house and the land and everything on it. "I'm not suggesting a donation. I'm suggesting an investment. The south pasture fencing needs replacing, not just repairing. Properly replaced, it will last 30 years. The current water system on the eastern land needs improvements. These are capital projects that will increase the ranch's value and productivity. The return on this investment will significantly exceed the return on anything else I might do with the money." "You don't have to invest it in the ranch," Warren said. "You could keep it for yourself, in your own account." "Warren," she said, with the particular patience she used when she wanted him to understand that he was being protective in a way she appreciated but did not require. "This is my ranch. My name is on the deed. I am not making an offering, I'm making a business decision." He was quiet for a moment. "I'll never tell you what to do with your money," he said. "I know," she said. "I'm telling you what I've decided to do with my money." He looked at her across the table with the expression she had come to understand was his version of openly adoring someone, which was quieter than other people's versions but entirely real. "All right," he said. "Good," Rose said. "I'll draw up the investment documentation tomorrow." "Of course you will," he said, and his voice was warm and dry and entirely alive. The improvements were made that summer, which was also the summer of their son. He arrived on a Tuesday in August, as predicted, in the bedroom of the ranch house with Dr. Finley in attendance and Senora Vasquez, providing the kind of practical support that no medical degree fully prepares a person for. He was healthy and loud, and had a remarkable quantity of dark hair for someone who had existed for approximately 6 hours. Warren, who had been in the barn by Rose's explicit instruction, because she did not want him pacing in the hallway while she was trying to concentrate, was brought in when it was over, and he stood at the bedside of his wife, who was tired and disheveled and entirely herself, and looked at his son with an expression that was not composed at all. It was just completely open and completely full. "He looks like an opinion," Rose said, looking at the baby. Warren slowly reached out and let the baby's impossibly small hand close around one of his fingers. He looked at this for a long time. "He's perfect," he said, and his voice was not quite steady and he didn't try to make it so. "He'll need a name," Rose said. "James," Warren said without hesitation. "James Rourke Norris." Rose looked at him. "Rourke." Her name in the middle of their son's name. "James Rourke Norris," she repeated. "His grandmother's name should be in there somewhere," Warren said. "Margaret, maybe, if we have a girl someday." Rose looked at her husband, at the man who had stood in a bank, and said her name goes on that paper, who had hired her on the strength of her own description of her abilities, who had amended a professional arrangement not because she had asked him to, but because it was the accurate thing to do, who had rearranged his entirely sufficient solitary life to accommodate another person's presence without making that accommodation feel like a concession, because it hadn't been a concession, it had been a choice, the most deliberate and certain choice he'd ever made. "James Rourke Norris," she said again. "Yes, that's right." The boy grew. He grew the way children on ranches grow, fast and sturdy and curious, with opinions about horses from an early age and a laugh that came from deep in his chest, and a habit of watching everything with the focused attention that he had inherited from both of his parents. He had Rose's dark eyes and Warren's coloring, and Senora Vasquez's complete confidence that the world would provide what he needed if he simply asked clearly. The ranch grew too. The improvements to the south pasture paid out in the second year, as Rose had projected. The eastern land, properly managed, transformed the ranch's grazing capacity. By 1887, the Norris Ranch was carrying 1,800 head of cattle and had a financial record that was the envy of ranchers across the county. Rose's accounts were legendary in the local agricultural community. Other ranchers' wives occasionally appeared at the Norris Ranch, ostensibly for social visits, actually to ask Rose how she organized her household ledgers. She showed them, because she believed that accurate bookkeeping was a skill that benefited everyone who practiced it, and she had no interest in keeping the method to herself. Harlan Peck had retired in 1886, citing health reasons, and been replaced at the First Territorial Bank by a younger man from Austin named Garrett who had no history with the Norris family and who processed loans with considerably more straightforward efficiency. Warren had a better banking relationship in the subsequent years, though Rose still read every contract before he signed anything, which she intended to continue doing indefinitely. In 1887, they had a daughter, who was named Margaret Carmen Norris, for Rose's aunt and Senora Vasquez, who received the news of being honored in this way with a silence that lasted a full 30 seconds before she gathered herself and made tea and talked about something else entirely, but who was seen, later, sitting with the baby and talking to her softly in a mixture of Spanish and English about the things worth knowing in this world. James was 4 when his sister was born, and approached her arrival with the careful scientific interest of a small person encountering a genuinely perplexing new phenomenon. He asked questions about her that were thoughtful and occasionally unanswerable. He was, within 2 weeks, entirely devoted to her, which was evident in the way he stationed himself near her whenever she was in a room and regarded anyone who came too close with an evaluating look that was pure Warren Norris. "He's going to be protective," Ike Calloway observed. "He comes by it honestly," Rose said. Warren, who was standing nearby, said nothing, but his expression suggested he found nothing wrong with this assessment. The years that followed were full years. They were not easy years, because ranching in Texas in the 1880s was never simply easy, but they were full. There were good seasons and difficult ones, market fluctuations and weather events, and the ordinary large and small dramas of a life being lived at full engagement with the world. Rose continued to manage the ranch's financial operations with the precision she had brought to it from the beginning, and she continued to be right about most things financial, which Warren acknowledged without resentment because he was not a man who resented competence. He was a man who valued it. They argued sometimes, because they were both people with strong convictions and no particular inclination toward false agreement. Their arguments tended to be substantive, about ranch policy or financial decisions or the education of their children, and they tended to reach conclusions that were better than what either of them had started with, because both of them were more interested in the right answer than in being the one who had thought of it. Rose had started teaching by 1888, not formally but practically, working with the children of the ranch's employees in the evenings twice a week. There were 8 children on the property by that time, from 4 families, and none of them had consistent access to the schoolhouse in town, which was too far and too expensive to reach reliably. She taught reading and arithmetic and geography and kept it practical, connecting everything to the world the children actually lived in. Warren had built a small additional room onto the house for this purpose, without being asked, which was how Warren showed love when he was not saying it directly, which was frequently. In the fall of 1888, a reporter from the San Antonio Express passed through Redemption Creek working on a story about the changing cattle industry, and arrived at the Norris Ranch on a referral from the county land office, which had apparently told him that the ranch had the best documented grazing rotation system in the region. He spent 2 days at the ranch and wrote a piece that appeared in the Express in November and mentioned, in its second paragraph, that the ranch's financial management was handled by Rose Rourke Norris, whom the reporter described as having a command of agricultural economics that would not have been out of place at a university. Rose had read this description 3 times. She had put the paper down and picked up the baby, who was Margaret, 14 months old and not yet walking but very clear about her opinions on most subjects. She had looked out the window at the ranch yard where Warren was talking with Ike about the winter cattle count. Warren came in at noon and found the newspaper on the table. He read the article. He looked at Rose across the kitchen. "He spelled your name correctly," he said. "He did," she said. "Good," Warren said, and sat down for lunch with the simple satisfaction of a man who has known for 4 years that his wife is exactly who the world is only now beginning to notice she is. The winter of 1888 was quiet and cold, and they sat in the evenings with the children between them and the accounts in order and the fire burning well, and the sound of Señora Vasquez singing something Spanish in the kitchen, and the particular quality of warmth that belongs to a house that has been genuinely inhabited by people who love each other. James had developed an early obsession with horses, specifically with the breeding and training of them, which Warren encouraged by giving him graduated responsibilities in the barn from the age of 4 on. By 6, he could assess a horse's condition with an eye that Ike Calloway described as pretty good for someone his height. Margaret was different, quieter and more internal, with Rose's habit of reading everything and her father's habit of assembling information before speaking. She had opinions, but she offered them precisely, and they tended to be correct. One evening in January of 1889, when the children were in bed and the house was quiet, Rose sat at the kitchen table with a letter she had been composing for 3 days. Warren came in from checking the barn, smelling of cold air and horses, and sat down across from her. "What is it?" he said. "I've been writing to the county school board," Rose said. "The schoolhouse in town is overcrowded. They've been trying to hire a second teacher for 2 years and can't find someone willing to come to Redemption Creek for what they're offering. I've written to suggest that if they would consider a formal arrangement, I could take on teaching duties for the children in the Eastern Rural District, the ones who can't get to town reliably." Warren looked at the letter. "What kind of formal arrangement?" "A paid position, under the county school board, as a district teacher for the rural East. I've outlined the curriculum I've been using here, which is already working, and I've proposed a salary that's modest enough that the board can actually fund it and sufficient enough that it's worth my time. Would you do it here at the ranch? The room you built would accommodate up to 12 children. I currently have 8. The other families in the Eastern District add another 4 or 5. It's workable." Warren was quiet, reading the letter. "You've been doing this unofficially for a year," he said. "Yes. I'd like it to be official, for the children so their schooling is recognized, and for me," she paused, "I'd like it to be documented." He looked at her across the table, and his expression was the one she had learned over 5 years to read as the place in him where pride and love lived together, the expression that had no name but that she recognized as surely as her own name. "Send the letter," he said. She sent it. The school board, after some initial deliberation that mostly consisted of the board members adjusting to the idea, approved the arrangement in March of 1889. The Norris Ranch East District School was not a formal name, but that was what people called it. And by the fall of 1889, Rose was teaching 11 children in the room Warren had built, with a proper curriculum and proper records, and a salary paid by Redemption Creek County, which was the first formally documented acknowledgement by any public institution in the county of Rose Rourke Norris's existence as a professional. She signed the employment contract with her full name, in the clear and legible hand she used for all important documents, and put the copy in the ranch files next to the original bookkeeping contract Warren had offered her 5 years before. There was a moment, sitting at the table that evening with the files in order and the house quiet and Warren reading across from her with his reading glasses on, which he had grudgingly acquired at the age of 35 and which made him look, she thought, unexpectedly distinguished, when Rose understood with the full weight of clarity that this was the life she had been trying to find. Not its approximation, not a compromise of it, but the actual, specific, documented, improbable thing itself. She had come back to Texas with a leather satchel and a letter for a dead man, looking for a place she belonged. She had found it in the most unexpected configuration, in the form of account books that needed organizing, and a man who could not maintain his own professional arrangements, and a piece of land along the Colorado River where the grass ran gold in October, and the stars were very close in winter. She had found it in a banker's office of all places, when a stubborn cattleman had set down his pen and turned to a small, precise man behind a mahogany desk and said, with perfect, unarguable conviction, that her name was going on the paper or no deal was getting done. Warren looked up from his reading, as he sometimes did when he felt her looking at him, which she had been doing. "What?" he said. "Nothing," she said. "I was just thinking about Harlan Peck's office." Warren was quiet for a moment. "That was a good day," he said. "It was," she agreed, "even with Peck's face." "Especially with Peck's face," Rose said, and they were both smiling now quietly in the way of two people who share a history that contains this particular moment and everything that followed from it. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. His hand turned under hers and held it, the way it had in the church 6 years before, with the same certain and deliberate warmth. "Grazing rotation tomorrow," she said. "South pasture first," he said. "Agreed," she said. They sat together in the lamplight of the kitchen they had made theirs, with the accounts in order and the children sleeping and the land outside quiet and cold and belonging to them both, every documented acre of it, and the fire burned well and the clock ticked and the night was long and good. And they were, by every measurable standard and every standard that resisted measurement, entirely where they were supposed to be. James Rourke Norris grew up to know cattle and horses better than most men twice his age, and took over the management of the herd at 17 in a way that was an easy transition, because he had been trained for it his whole life. Margaret Carmen Norris grew up to be a teacher like her mother and a landowner like both her parents, and when the county opened a new formal schoolhouse in the Eastern District in 1901, they named it after Rose, which Rose found moderately embarrassing but which she admitted privately was accurate. Warren managed the Norris Ranch until he was 58, at which point he and Rose made a formal transition of operational responsibility to James, though Rose continued to consult on the financial management because she simply could not stop finding better ways to do things, and James had the wisdom to understand that this was an asset rather than an interference. There was a third child, too, born in 1891, a boy they named Thomas Eduardo Norris, for no complicated reason except that they liked the name, and Eduardo, Dolar's husband, had been a steady and good friend to them since the beginning. Thomas turned out to have his grandmother Margaret's love of books and his mother's precision, and ended up reading law in Austin, which nobody on the ranch had expected, but which in retrospect seemed inevitable, given the family's long-standing conviction that everything important should be properly documented. Senora Vasquez lived to be 81, which she regarded as the minimum acceptable age, and had no particular feelings about exceeding. She remained at the Norris Ranch until the end, in the room that had been hers for over 40 years, tending the garden she had rebuilt after the bull incident with the patience and thoroughness of a woman who intended to outlast every animal on the property, which she did. The grandchildren called her abuela, and she received this title as her due. Ike Calloway retired at 65 and moved to a small house in Redemption Creek that was, by coincidence, 2 streets from the Norris family's town property, which they had purchased in 1892 as a place to stay when the children were in school. He and Warren still had coffee on Tuesday mornings throughout their respective retirements, which was not a planned arrangement, but simply what happened because they had been having coffee on Tuesday mornings for 35 years and saw no reason to stop. The Norris Ranch survived everything that followed: the drought of 1893, the market collapse of 1896, the fencing wars, the creeping arrival of the railroads that changed the shape of the cattle business entirely. It survived because it was well managed and debt-free, and documented with a precision that allowed it to adapt to changing circumstances, without the kind of crisis that destroyed ranches that had been run on handshake and habit. And on the wall of the office in the ranch house, framed behind glass with the careful attention given to important things, hung the original copy of the loan document from the First Territorial Bank of Redemption Creek, dated October 1884. The document that had started a change and contained, on its signatory line, two names in two different hands: Warren Norris, Rose Rourke. The document that had proved, in the most official way available to the world at the time, that she belonged exactly where she was, her name on the paper, right where it had always been meant to be.